Hey guys, welcome back. I just want to do a quick recap on complex numbers, kind of where we saw them, what they are. So I'll write down a couple examples of complex numbers. Say 2 plus 3i, negative 2 minus 5i, 17 plus 0i. That's a good one. I like it. So every complex number is made up of two parts, a real part and an imaginary part. Right? And we can see that everywhere. Here's our real. Here's our imaginary. Here's our real. And here's our imaginary. And so the general form for every complex number is a plus bi, where a is our real number and bi is our imaginary number. So we're going to take a quick little sidebar to talk about, well, what is an imaginary number? An imaginary number, if you recall, is the square root of negative 1. That's our imaginary number. So if we took the square root of negative 4, that would be 2i. Square root of negative 9 would be 3i, and so on. Again, the square root of a negative is what gives you the I. This negative right here, that's what gives us the I. This negative, that's what gives us the I. And so there's a little pattern that you can we go through. You guys memorize where I to the first was I squared was negative 1, and that comes from I squared, that's the square root of negative 1 squared. So these cancel out, and we just get I squared is negative 1. I to the third is the same thing as I times I squared, which would be negative I. And I to the fourth, I squared times I squared, negative 1 times negative 1, which is just positive 1. So I'd say of these four, the most important one to make sure you have 100% memorized, got to know I squared is negative 1. Have to know that. You can figure out the other two using the other properties, but you got to know I squared is negative 1. That's going to really help you. So where do we see complex numbers? Well, we usually see them when we're solving. So we have 3 steps we like to check when we solve. First, we check, is it factorable? Then we check, well, can you isolate x? Is there just one x and we can get it by itself? So for example, here, there are 2 x's. We can't combine them because they're not like terms. So there's too many x's, we can't isolate it. So the third step we check is, or what we have to do, is the quadratic formula, which is x equals opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And we'll give this to you. So we know we can't isolate it. Is it factorable? I'll save you some time. It's not. And honestly, you might even sometimes want to start with these two, especially because we're dealing with complex numbers and we've never factored an imaginary complex number. If it is factorable, that means you're probably, at least in our course, dealing with real numbers. So let's do that. We're going to do the quadratic formula here. You have to set this thing equal to 0. So we're going to add 26 to both sides. And we get x squared plus 2x plus 26 equals 0. Now we can go through. Again, our a is going to be this 1. Our b will be 2. And our c is 26. So we get x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times by 1 times by 26 over 2 times 1. That brings us to x equals negative 2 plus or minus. And when you do the quadratic formula, you're really just simplifying what's happening in the square root. So this will be the square root of 4 minus 104. You can even type in your calculator. It's going to give you a negative 100 over 2. we get x equals -2 plus or minus square root of -100 is 10i. Again, I'm only working within the radical every time. Divided by 2, and we check our last step. Does 2 divide into both these? It does. So you'd get x equals -1 plus or minus 5i. And how many answers are there? There's 2 answers, right? There is x equals -1 plus 5i and x equals -1 minus 5i. Good. So that's one way we'll do it, is the quadratic formula. Next way I'll show you is isolating x. So we'd go through here. The first thing I notice right away is there's just one x. We can absolutely isolate this x, right? Like, quick sidebar. If I gave you a problem like this, you would go through and just isolate the x, right? -5, then you divide by 3. We're going to do the same thing here. We just have to get this x alone. So we'll start by adding 3 to both sides. X minus 6 squared equals -16. How do we get rid of that square? Well, take the square root. What's the square root of -16? X minus 6 equals plus or minus 4i. Do not forget that plus or minus, right? We should be getting 2 answers out of these. Add 6 to both sides. You get x equals 6 plus or minus 4. Again, 4i, sorry. Again, that is 2 different answers. 6 plus 4i and 6 minus 4i. Hope this helped. Go through, watch the lesson for the next video, and make sure it makes sense. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks.